10 scientists and engineers, all tied to America's most classified research, all dead or vanished within the same few years. That much isn't in dispute. It's documented, case by case, name by name. What's disputed is whether it means anything at all. And by this spring, that question had pulled in the FBI, the US Congress, and the White House. It started with one man walking out of his house and never coming back. Friday morning, February 27, 2026, Albuquerque, New Mexico. William Neil McCasland, a retired Air Force Major General who spent his career running some of the country's most sensitive research, left his phone on the counter. His glasses, his smartwatch still charging. What he took with him was a pair of hiking boots and a revolver. Nobody has seen him since. He's the reason this whole story exists, but he's only one of 10. The specifics matter here. McCasland wasn't just any retired general. He was the 7th commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory, and he'd run a directorate at Wright-Patterson, a base that's been tangled up in UFO folklore since Roswell. He'd also briefly consulted on a novel, a job that came with a loose, brief tie to the UFO community. Somewhere in there, that thin thread of involvement became, in certain corners of the internet, proof he knew something he wasn't supposed to know. His wife tried to shut that down almost immediately. She wrote publicly that he'd held nothing but ordinary clearances for 13 years since retiring, the kind thousands of contractors carry. Whatever secrets he might have had, she said, they weren't exactly fresh. Search teams flew helicopters over the canyons behind his house, infrared cameras scanning for a heat signature in the dark. An unseasonably warm spring worked against them. The sun-warmed rock and a human body were reading as the same temperature, so the cameras couldn't tell one from the other. Nobody found him. Not in the first week. In March, a gray sweatshirt turned up 1.25 miles from his house. Nothing else. Not by summer. And that gap, the not knowing, is exactly the kind of space a theory can move into. Because McCasland's disappearance didn't stay McCasland's disappearance for long. Within weeks, people online were pulling up old obituaries, old missing person flyers, searching for anyone, anywhere who'd ever worked near a national lab, a defense contractor, an aerospace program, and had died or vanished under circumstances that could, with enough squinting, look strange. One name that resurfaced was Ning Li, a superconductivity researcher whose 1990s papers on a theoretical anti-gravity effect had made actual physicists sit up. She'd suffered permanent brain damage in a 2014 accident, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's soon after, and died quietly in 2021. None of that stopped her from being folded into the pattern 5 years later. Another name was Amy Eskridge, an Alabama researcher chasing that same anti-gravity idea. In 2022, she died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Before her death, she'd talked on a podcast about what she described as a psychological campaign against her work. That detail is genuinely unsettling on its own. It's also, on its own, not evidence of anything but a woman in crisis. Then, in December 2025, before any of this had a name, a physicist named Nuno Loureiro was shot dead at his home near Boston. A real physicist, a real homicide. Unsolved for months. That's the case that changed everything. Because for the first time, the pattern people were building online had an actual, unambiguous murder sitting inside it. Not a suicide you could argue about, not a disappearance with no body, a killing. By April, the FBI was reviewing 10 separate cases. The House Oversight Committee wanted answers. And a theory that had started with one general's missing boots now had a name of its own: the Missing Scientists Conspiracy. What happens when investigators, real ones with subpoena power, start taking a fringe theory seriously? That's where this goes next. On April 29, 2026, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts closed the loop on Nuno Loureiro's murder. A Portuguese national named Claudio Valente had done it. Not a foreign intelligence operation, not a cover-up. Investigators said the motive traced back to ordinary personal dissatisfaction, unhappiness with where his life and career had ended up. Nothing more exotic than that. One mystery, cleanly solved. It didn't slow the larger theory down at all. By then, the story had already left the true crime corners of the internet. A Missouri congressman had personally asked the FBI to get involved. The House Oversight Chairman said publicly he doubted it was all coincidence. At a White House briefing, a reporter asked the press secretary about it directly and got a real answer about agencies reviewing the cases holistically for common threads. Even the president weighed in, calling it serious, but adding he hoped it was random. That's an unusual amount of institutional weight for a theory built mostly out of obituaries. And then, in April, it absorbed a name that mattered to an entirely different audience: Nick Pope. If you've ever watched a UFO documentary, you've probably seen him. For 3 years in the 90s, Pope ran the actual British government desk that fielded UFO reports, a real job at the real Ministry of Defense. He spent the decades after that as the genuine article, the expert other documentaries called in. In February 2026, Pope announced he had stage 4 esophageal cancer that had spread to his liver. He kept doing interviews from home near the end. He died at home in Arizona on April 6th at 60. His wife, the anthropologist Elizabeth Weiss, later put the absurdity of it as plainly as anyone did in this whole affair. To believe the conspiracy, she said, you'd have to believe the government had planted a cancer gene in her husband years earlier, one that activated on schedule and fooled every doctor and every scan along the way. Nobody, including Pope's own community, thought that math worked. It's worth sitting with what this theory actually cost people. One widow called the idea absolute nonsense and said her husband would have laughed. Hicks's daughter said there was no logical thread connecting her father to any of it. She couldn't help but laugh either. Hicks's own brother, less able to find it funny, said his brother's real scientific legacy was about to get buried under conspiracy noise instead. A woman named Melissa Casillas, folded into the list as a missing lab worker, was found months later in a New Mexico forest, exactly where her family and state police had said all along she'd gone, of her own will, under enormous personal stress. These weren't clues. They were people's actual lives, reread backward until they fit a shape somebody else needed. Here's the number that should have ended it early. A science writer ran the math. Over 700,000 people hold top-secret clearances in America's aerospace and nuclear sectors. Apply ordinary mortality statistics to a population that size over a 4-year window, and you'd expect something like 250 of them to die by homicide or suicide anyway, with thousands more dying of natural causes. 10 or 11 names, pulled from that pool and stitched together after the fact, isn't a pattern, it's arithmetic. A sociologist who studies this for a living called it apophenia, the very human habit of finding connections in noise once you've already decided the connections are there. As for Neil McCasland, the man whose missing boots started all of it, nobody has found him. His case remains open. Somewhere between a health crisis nobody saw coming and a mountain that swallowed a search team's infrared cameras whole, the actual, unconspiratorial explanation for what happened to him is still sitting out there, unexamined by the people who were so certain they already knew.